All right, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today. And welcome to our sixth installment of Ask the Experts webinar series hosted by Archer. First, before we dive into it, on behalf of Archer, we hope that you and your family and friends and coworkers are all safe and healthy. And secondly, and of importance to us here in this industry, thank you for all that you are doing, you and your teams and your organizations across the country to literally keep the lights on. We really, really appreciate all that you do. So thank you, and thank you for taking a few minutes to join us today. Today we're going to talk about PRC-026, stability studies and GOTO applicability. We've got a great panel lined up today. I'll introduce them, or more importantly, I'll have them introduce themselves here just shortly. We're going to do a real high-level overview of the standard, but most importantly, we want to take your questions. So any and all questions are welcome. There's a couple different ways you can ask those questions. At the bottom of your screen, you can click on the button that says raise your hand, and we can go ahead and give you the hot mic, and you can ask it live, and we can have a great dialogue. Alternatively, you can type in your question at the bottom, and we will read it and answer it live today as well. I do have several questions that have been emailed in advance, so I will start with those, and we'll pivot as I see more of yours coming in real time. So first, I'm going to do just a couple-minute introduction of Archer, only because a few of you on this call probably have not worked with us, so I thought it'd be good just to spend 2 minutes to introduce Archer, let you know who we are, what we do, and then really get right into the meat of the day, and that's answering your questions and talking about PRC-026. So first of all, who's Archer? Archer is a consulting company that was formed about 6 years ago by 4 partners who all have literally spent decades in the utility space focusing on operations, security, and compliance. The partners all ran large organizations within utility companies, building and maturing security, operations, and compliance teams, and developing strategies. 3 of the 4 partners also went on to become some of the first compliance auditors in the country and really have a passion around security and the compliance that supports it. So we're excited today to dive into maybe just a snippet of that. However, Archer's continued to build over the last several years and really has focused its hiring on tenured, credentialed resources, really focusing on building our teams, focusing on operations and planning excellence, compliance, physical and cybersecurity verticals. Our teams work heavily in the utility space, but we also work in oil and gas, mining, food processing, and really just about any other OT-centric industries. Our teams we really handle everything from project work such as gap analysis, mock audits, general assessments, whether it's security, compliance, or operations related, all the way through really full staff augmentation and virtual compliance teams for operations and planning, as well as NERC. So hopefully that gives you just a little bit of insight to Archer for those of you that may not have been overly familiar with us. But most importantly, as I mentioned, we want to get to your questions, and to do that probably makes sense for us to do a quick round of introductions by our panelists, and we'll just kind of go in order from Richard, Jim, and Brian. So Richard, if you'd go ahead and kick it off with introductions.
No, thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. This is Richard Shiflett. I'm Archer's O&P Director for Operations and Planning Practice. My background, you could say, began with the U.S. Navy in the nuclear power program. I was a mechanical operator on submarines running the nuclear propulsion plant, and went off to college and ended up at the Bureau of Reclamation at the largest generator in North America, the Great Grand Coulee Dam. Was there for 11 years, 4 of which were as a compliance manager for both SIP and O&P standards at the time, and left as a senior electrical engineer. I went on to the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, otherwise known as WEC, as a compliance risk engineer, processing self-reports, mitigation plans, and helped stood up the IRA and ICE evaluations. then moved into the O&P auditor role and conducted many audits on utilities in the WEC region. Then went into the consulting space, which lands me here with Archer. Jim, you next.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Jim Turpening. I've been in the utility industry for a number of years. I worked for a publicly owned utility for over 35 years. I retired there as operation and maintenance superintendent for LA and Orange County. I had the opportunity to spend a number of years to teach and to work with utilities internationally, such places as Guam, Saipan, Micronesia. From there, I went over to WEC and was an auditor. In fact, one of the first auditors for the WECC. I worked there for about 12 years. And then a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, in fact, I came over here with Archer to work with them. And this has been a most pleasant experience and quite an educational one. I just hope this webinar will have the opportunity to expand your knowledge and your horizons on these standards. Thank you. Brian?
This is Brian Heaney. I graduated from MIT in Boston way back in 1986. Spent my first year at Boston Edison Company doing distribution planning, and then moved out to San Francisco, where I worked for Pacific Gas and Electric for 13 years doing transmission planning and transmission operation studies. So that's my primary background. After that, I moved to utility system efficiencies, where I continued to do planning and operation studies until about 2007, when the standards came out. We started up a compliance group at USC, which was eventually purchased by Archer, and I've been with Archer now for, oh gosh, about 2 years or so.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate your time today as well. So why don't we start with a high-level overview of PRC-26. And Richard, if you would not mind, just giving folks a high level, we've got varying degrees of experience and expertise on the phone, so probably good to start in level set. So Richard?
Okay, sure. Thank you all for joining us on this discussion on PRC-26. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section or by raising a hand in the Zoom meeting. Mark will grab those and post those out. So PRC-26 is a relatively new standard on the in the NERC framework. Requirement 1 became effective January 2018, so it's been out for a couple of years now. And R2 through R4 became effective just this last January. So hopefully everybody's now up to speed, depending upon your registered function, of course. There's 4 requirements to this standard, so it's not very lengthy. Requirement 1 deals with the planning coordinators and identifying cases where angular stability is an issue for certain BES elements in the system. And of course, those get communicated down to the transmission owners and generator owners, who in R2 have to perform some assessments of their protective relay settings, specifically those that are load responsive, that they meet the criteria in the standard. This standard, of course, gets into a lot of technical details, which we're not going to dive off into the protection engineering arena as part of our Q&A so much, but looking at things from a compliance posture basis, if you will. And then R3 and R4 dealing with the corrective action plans that may come out of the processes associated with requirement 2 that the transmission owner and generator owner will need to develop if deficiencies are noted. So that's just a very high-level overview of the standard. You could say that R1 is a sort of a performance-based requirement that the PC is performing an evolution and makes these notifications. R2 with 2 sub-requirements is a combination of performance and event-driven. The event-driven piece being that R2.2, where there's, if upon a power swing occurring, there's an analysis that needs to be performed. and then R3 and R4, of course, being event-driven, dependent upon if the event requires a corrective action plan. So that's just a quick kind of run through, and at this point, I think we'll go ahead and move to questions and answers.
Thanks, Richard. Why don't we start with we'll start with a couple softballs for you, and then we'll move from there. The first one, Richard, if you want to take it, and then we'll pass it on then to Jim or Brian as needed. May we use our annual TPL-1 planning assessment as evidence that we analyze the BES elements for the R1 criteria?
Well, certainly, but it's important to note that the evidence, the direct evidence anyway, for requirement 1 are those notifications being given as a result of the analysis that's already been performed. Certainly, you can use your TPL-1 annual planning assessments as the input as far as identifying those angular stability issues. But I think that the main focus on evidence here is looking to see that those notifications were provided to the transmission owners or generator owners if there are BES elements identified in relation to these angular stability issues. Jim, Brian?
This is Brian. I'll jump in. I think it's important to note that R1 is what we would call an event-triggered requirement. So it only really kicks in if the event happens. And the event that we're concerned about here is that you've identified an issue with angular stability. So as Richard pointed out, the TPL study is one source that you may use to identify those, but that is not requested in the evidence requested table or in the auditor checklist. So what I prefer to see for this is a list of all facilities that were identified in any study that where angular stability was determined to be an issue. And then if the auditor wants to go down and do random sampling on those lists of facilities, then they can ask you for evidence that you notified the owner of that facility.
Thanks,
right.
Brian.
Jim, do you have any?
Well, if there's, go ahead, Brian. If there's a number of BES events such as this, tracking and having that information for the auditor, because if there should be, I doubt this would ever happen, but should there be a multiple, they will do a deep dive and ask for specific answers and questions and evaluations that were made for each event. And that can come in like Ryan said, it can come in any one of many different forms for the auditor himself. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. We'll go right to the second question. Other than the TPL 1-4 study, what other types of studies might identify facilities that meet the criteria under R1?
I'll jump in on this one. This is Brian. Any study that is performed where dynamic stability analysis is performed could potentially identify a facility that is related to an angular stability problem. So there's all sorts of studies out there where dynamic stability is performed. This could include nomogram studies, under voltage load shedding studies, under frequency load shedding studies, or remedial action scheme studies. So basically, anytime you're running dynamic stability for a study, you should keep in mind that this could be potential evidence for PRC-026.
Great, Brian. Thank you.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay, Jim.
No, I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay.
Very good, Brian. No, I don't.
Excellent. Next one. What other evidence will auditors be expecting to see provided for R1?
This is Richard. as we've pointed out that the initial evidence, of course, is those notifications that are provided. Of course, there may be cases for an individual PC where there are no angular stability issues identified for BES elements, and notifications may not be required at all. So that gets down to what do you do in the null set? You may consider, of course, so there's a question in the RSA asking if you had any identified BES elements, since you list them out. In that case, you would list no. But an auditor will also look to see some justifying language as to how you concluded that to prove the null set. And that's where you would, of course, point often to the studies that you were that were performed either as part of your annual planning assessments or the other ones that Brian mentioned earlier. In the case you do have BES elements, if you have a large list, say more than 9, say, you'll of course list those elements in the RSA unless it's very lengthy, in which case you might provide a spreadsheet. An auditor will likely random sample that list and then ask for the individual notifications associated with each of those BES elements. But I would still probably have in your back pocket available if a data request comes out to provide the study information or such justifying that those particular elements were chosen and why, or perhaps even cases where certain elements were not chosen if the auditor asks about those particular BES elements based upon some risk analysis or such. Brian or Jim?
No, I think that pretty well covers it. The auditors will do a dive on it, so be prepared.
This is Brian. I'll jump in. One thing that I've been working on with our clients is developing report templates that are not only useful to the people that are performing the studies, but are also auditor friendly. And one thing that you can do is in studies where you're performing dynamic stability analysis, have a separate section that's dedicated to PRC-026. And either in that section, either list the elements where angular stability issues were identified, or make a statement that says that no such facilities were identified in this particular study. Then when you go to prepare your evidence, you keep track of those studies, and you can cite the individual sections in those reports as evidence that you've looked at this and you've documented whether these issues exist or not. That way, when you get to that RSA question where you check no and it asks you for an explanation, you'll have a ready answer for how you determined that these facilities existed or they didn't exist, because they'll be documented in each one of your study reports. That's all I had.
Great, thank you. The next one, Brian, this one may be a little more in your wheelhouse. What is a UFLS design assessment study and who performs them?
Well, I'll draw Richard in on this as well. UFLS is under frequency load shedding studies. Those are performed under the PRC standards. And under frequency load shedding is a load that's equipped with a relay that drops when the frequency gets too low to help us maintain system reliability. So Richard, do you want to chime in on that at all?
Yes, well, just a little bit perhaps. These as part of the study that you perform, it's done on a periodic basis. PRC-6 addresses these, and then there's certain regional groups that also deal with under frequency load shedding schemes. As a result of the studies that are done in coordination of that, there may possibly be angular stability issues identified from them. So there's a potential that UFLS studies may be useful as evidence, not perhaps directly contained within the RSA, but as follow-up to perhaps a data request for identifying those BES elements that were important for angular stability.
I'm going to add one more thing, Richard, and this is something that, let me back up one second, but R1 is geared towards the planning coordinator. The planning coordinator is the responsible entity. And in theory, if you're a planning coordinator, you're probably participating in these under-frequency load shedding studies. If your company is registered as a planning coordinator and you're not aware of any under-frequency load shedding studies or have not participated in them, it would be worth checking to make sure that none of your facilities have been identified in those studies, and maybe consider the fact that you should be participating in those studies if they're covering your area.
Good point.
Thank you. The next question actually asks something around the planning coordinator and those elements as well. Assuming our planning coordinator has not identified any of our BES elements per R1, do we get to ignore R2 through R4 of the standard?
Unfortunately not. So R2 gets into some actions that GOT and TO have to perform if they do receive a notification from the planning coordinator of applicable elements, specifically R2.1. 2.2, however, doesn't hinge upon that notification, but instead it's about the awareness of a protection system trip for those elements, generators, transformers, or transmission lines, specifically, that trip in response to a stable or unstable power swing. I would expect that as part of your PRC-4 analysis, which is done after a protection system trip, that PRC-26 may be an intrinsic part of that particular process, so that when you're looking to identify whether a protection system operated correctly or a misoperation occurred, that you're also looking for power swings. And then if that protection relay tripped as a result of the power swing, stable or unstable, that's when R2.2, the standard, comes into play. And then R3 and R4 follow up only if a deficiency is noted because the protection relay settings did not meet the criteria of attachment B. Jim or Brian?
I don't have anything to add, Richard.
That was very thorough, Richard. That's and that is a key point when you're dealing with PRC-4. So a good point, well taken. Thank you.
Moving on to the next question. For relays that are in scope for R2, are the calculations used to determine compliance sufficient evidence?
I would say it depends upon how much information is included with those calculations. The auditor is going to want to see that the attachment B criteria is met. So there's going to be some calculations done with regards to your system parameters and the determination of certain thresholds, such as current, and that your relay settings were thus set such that they are compliant with those calculations. So I would see a combination of elements there. If your calculation sheets document that how the attachment B criteria's thresholds were met, that may form the basis for your evidence, and then an auditor could simply random sample those and then ask for the relay settings to verify the relays were set according to your calculations. And if there's, say, less than 9 relays involved, you might just include all of them just by default anyway, rather than having a random sample for such a small size. Jim, Brian?
Yeah, having those readily available for the auditor that's a good thing, so that he has the opportunity to review what's been done and the completeness and the thoroughness of the work that you've presented. So that's very well taken. A good point, Richard.
This is Brian. I'll add in that the Measure 2 actually provides a pretty good laundry list of the types of evidence that you could possibly provide. The other item here is this is an event-triggered requirement that has a milestone associated with it, the 12 full calendar months. So what we'll need is evidence of the date the notification was received, and also dated evidence of the date that you met the requirement, so that we can compare or ensure that you've met that milestone.
Thanks, Brian, for that additional clarification. I've got a few questions left, and I see that we've had a few more attendees join. So just a quick note: if you have any additional questions, feel free to type them in at the bottom. You can click on the Q&A section or raise your hand, and you get to ask it live. I'll go ahead and continue with the questions that I do have in front. What other evidence will auditors be expecting to see provided for R2?
Well, as Brian's already alluded, and the RSAW requires that you list the BES elements that were identified for the by the PC, and if you have any elements identified by the PC, that is, for R2.1. And then, of course, each of those elements, I need to have the protective relays with load responsive settings identified associated with those elements. For requirement 2.2, since that's more of an event-driven where we're looking for a protection relay trip due to a power swing, that's going to be more of a list of trip events with information including dates when it was discovered and the protection relays involved. Subsequent to that, you need to provide evidence, of course, that the relays met the criteria of the attachment B and when that determination was made. As Brian pointed out, you've got 12 full calendar months to conduct that analysis. Jim, Brian?
I'll go along with what Brian said earlier, that there's a treasure trove of information that the measurement 2 has for the second requirement here, and having those available and able to demonstrate those to the auditor at the time of the audit, and be they an email, RX diagram, setting sheets, or whatever, is very important for compliance with this particular requirement. So Brian, I support everything you said there, that there's a list of items there that we can have ready for the auditor when he arrives. Very good.
Yeah, this is Brian. I'll just add that in my mind, look, the best practice that I have seen during our mock audits is for requirements like this, let's have a list of each of the notifications that was received during the audit period, list the notification date, list the completion date, and then have a column that shows the elapsed calendar months. So the auditor just goes down the list and can readily identify that each of the notifications was resolved within the 12 calendar months.
Excellent, excellent.
Great. Next question. How much time do we have to complete a corrective action plan under R4? Richard, do you want to take that?
Sure. There is no time limit specified in the standard. So you've essentially got as much time as you need to complete a corrective action plan. Now, the development of that action plan, you have within 6 full calendar months of determining that relay does not meet the attachment B criteria to develop the corrective action plan. But once you've developed it and implemented it, there is no time frame to complete. However, please keep in mind that a corrective action plan per the NERC glossary needs 2 important pieces. First of all, the actions you're going to take to mitigate the deficiency. And secondly, and sometimes forgotten, is the timeline to accomplish those actions. And if you look at R4, it goes in to talk to updating that corrective action plan, or CAP, if you will, if the actions or timetables change during the completion of that CAP. So if the you have outage constraints, you'll be getting replacement relays, and those take time to procure, et cetera, and your milestones for your corrective action plan change, you'll need to document changes to the CAP and be able to demonstrate that at any future audit. Jim, Brian?
And it's very important that those dates are tracked, and there's a comment or a statement that's made as to why the timeline has been changed. Or it's also important that when you present this CAP or CA corrective action plan, that there's an explanation for why it was lengthened, and then also give it the dates, as well as you're traveling through this timeline, that there's notes in here from when events that had happened, when equipment arrived. Sometimes it's better to, sometimes I've even had laden bills material as part of the evidence to demonstrate that the entity that we were working with was in fact moving down the timeline towards completion. And all of this is just, it really helps you as you present to the auditor, give them a broad picture of what has happened, what is happening, and what's going to happen. So it's a little bit of busy work, I understand, but in the end, it's going to help out when it comes time to audit. Brian?
I don't have anything to add, guys.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Question, what type of details should be provided for the corrective action plans in R3 and R4?
I think Jim outlaid quite a few details that you'd want to include as far as evidence goes regarding corrective action plans. Of course, this assumes that you have any during a given audit period. If it's a null set, then of course there's no real evidence to provide in that case. But assuming you have a corrective action plan, it's obviously important that it have the two pieces that need to be present within, being the actions that are going to be taken and the time frames for implementing those actions. And then documenting when the corrective action plans were developed for R3 and then completed for R4. And then, of course, if there were any revisions to those corrective action plans, those would also need to be noted either part of a revision history in the corrective action plan itself, or through perhaps an evidence table or spreadsheet that lists some reference to that specific CAP and how it was revised over time, including the dates of those revisions. Jim, Brian, can you think of anything else?
I think you got it, Richard.
Yeah, I think you hit it. You got it all, Richard.
Very good. That was actually the last question that I have received. So what I'm going to do now is allow each of you to pontificate and give some parting words of wisdom on this topic. Maybe just a note ahead of there. For anybody that comes up with a question, my email address is on the screen there. You can feel free to send me an email at any point with any questions you have, and I'll make sure one of our experts answer the questions. Trust me, it will not be me who answers it. It will be one of these three gentlemen, most likely. So please don't hesitate to send me a note with any questions that you may come up with after this. This session is being recorded. We'll post it out to our website where you can find links to all of our upcoming Ask the Expert series. Next couple, as it relates to operations and planning that we've got on the docket, is PRC-5R3, as well as FAC8. So those will be coming up early next month as well, and are ready to take enrollments. So with that, why don't we just go in order from Brian, Jim, and Richard, some parting thoughts and wisdom. So Brian?
Okay, thanks, Mark. I wanted to touch on two items. One, I will probably sound like a broken record, but I always like to stress that the ARSA is our best friend. And in this case for PR-26, we have a relatively new RSAW. So it has sections in purple for the evidence requested table and also for the compliance assessment approach checklist. These are both very important items that a lot of people skip over. You should read both of these sections before you even start drafting your narrative. The evidence requested table will tell you exactly which evidence the auditor wants you to provide. And the checklist is a checklist that the auditor needs to complete, and they need to be able to check off each item on that list. So you will want to structure your narrative so you basically walk the auditor through that checklist and present each item in your evidence table. So definitely read those and use those to your best advantage. Also wanted to point out that for R1, as I mentioned before, this is event triggered, but there are 4 criteria. And so your narrative needs to address each one of those criteria. And in this case, it would be to your advantage if you don't have remedial action schemes or you don't have under frequency load shedding relays, clearly state that in your narrative, because those are items that the auditor will be concerned about, and you will avoid a data request if you just tell them up front, hey, we don't have those particular items. There are some items, though, the FACT-14 studies, that's associated with the second bullet, and your planning assessment study, which is the 4th bullet. As a planning coordinator, you are required to perform both of those types of studies, so you will need to address those in your narrative. And as I mentioned earlier, make sure that those report templates have a section in there that addresses PRC-26. That's all I had, Mark.
Thank you, Brian. Jim?
Very good, Brian. All of that is very good. The only thing I harp on this every time we have one of these, and that is be sure and list, and this is trivia, I realize, but it's very important to the auditor, because remember, he's coming into an entity such as yours, and he has no idea well, he does have a good idea, but you have specific items that you refer to, and it's a generic jargon that you use within the organization. And sometimes it's a little difficult for the auditor to determine exactly what we're trying to say. But laying out the material, as Brian has stated, is of paramount of importance. And I can only reinforce what Brian has said, is that you come to the answering of the RSAW in a very organized fashion and in a easy methodology to where the auditor can look at the evidence and know exactly where and what is being required of the standard, and then answer that as succinctly as you can. Very good, Brian. Richard?
Well, you both sort of stole my thunder, but I guess I would just remind folks on the call that take a look at your PRC4 processes. That may be the vehicle you want to use to identify your processes for R2.2, to look for those cases where a protection relay with load responsive elements trips in response to a power swing, that those get evaluated. And then, of course, that you can document that for any future audit. And of course, follow-up would be the relays were set according to the attachment B criteria, and demonstrating that through evidence. And that's it for me.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you for all our attendees for being present and asking questions. If you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and we look forward to seeing you on our future events. Have a great rest of the day and have a wonderful week. Thank you.